Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is David Kelso, filling in for Gary Arndt today. He's off somewhere making up new nicknames for Joel. Anyways, today we're continuing our conversation with Dr. Anton Howes talking about coal. Did it really become popular because of homes, or was it actually something else? Let's find out as Joel continues the conversation with Dr. Anton Howes.
One of the themes that we've hit on this podcast on a number of occasions is the connection between beer and innovation, which is obviously your area of expertise. Do you find that when you study innovation, that it seems that brewers in many cases are kind of at the forefront of technological breakthroughs throughout human history?
Often. I can't think of many cases of brewers being inventors outside of their field, but I think given the scale of brewing, one thing that's interesting about brewing is it's from very early on one of the more capital intensive industries. So you've got a lot of very moneyed men effectively taking over, especially in this period as the scale of breweries starts to increase dramatically. It had been the case that throughout the Middle Ages and I guess well into the early 16th century, that a lot of brewing was kind of done in the home. It was kind of a very small scale thing, often done by women. So brewsters, the stir being the kind of so if you think of spinner and spinster, brewer and brewster, sometimes survives in people's surnames, but the brewsters are kind of supplanted in around this exact same period. I'm not sure if it's completely related. I suspect it is, but they're supplanted during exactly the same time, just as coal is supplanting wood in brewing. That it becomes this very highly capital intensive industry. And so brewers do often they end up being funders of innovation. They end up being, because they've got these big pools of capital, they end up being pretty interesting financiers in the 18th century. And they're very, very quick to adopt new technologies. So, steam engines, some of the earliest adoption of a lot of kind of mechanization is often by brewers because, frankly, they've got the deeper pockets to be able to do so and be first in line when a new technology comes along. And I guess with those deeper pockets, be able to take risks.
What did you think the connection was between steam and brewing? I noticed you mentioned that too in your essay.
Well, steam engines very early on can be used for pumping. So there's a lot that you can do there as a brewer. It's quite useful. There's a knock-on effect immediately from when you've got any kind of grinding work that's going on, because obviously malt has to be very lightly ground, or at least that's the part of the process that they use at the time. And from what I can tell, there seems to be anything in the brewing process that involves any kind of mechanization. The brewers seem to be first in line for that. So steam engines is part of that too.
I'm going to jump off of what Joel just asked about how I think part of the innovation in which someone comes up with an invention, brewers are one of the first to adopt it. One of the things about brewing is that it spans such a vast technological range of you've got thermodynamics, so heating things up and cooling things down very controlled, all the way to microbiology where you've got yeast doing a lot of the work. And so I think as all of these innovations start to emerge throughout the Industrial Revolution, brewers will find a spot for it. I mean, even back a couple episodes, we were talking about kind of neuroscience and like just the psychology of, the way that folks interact with each other is different when you have a beer in your hands versus not. So I think that there's plenty of opportunities for brewers to embrace any innovation that comes along. And really kind of the way you get these things off the ground is, be the first follower to a new technology.
Yeah, or simply raising water, right? There's such huge quantities of water that are being used, right? So the really early steam engines, things like the Savory engine, the Newcomen engine, they're just used for pumping. Mm-hmm. So the Newcomen engine becomes famous for pumping water out of coal mines because that's one of the main places it's very cost effective to use. But as that improves in efficiency, and then as it's supplanted by even more efficient engines like the Watt engine, I think brewers often see that, okay, great, this is solving one of the big problems that we've had where we effectively had to use horses, having a stable full of horses just to keep going round and round and round to lift buckets or whatever. if you've got something else where you're already consuming loads of coal, if you've got loads of coal already coming in as well, you can then start saying, okay, we'll just feed that to the engine and that can help raise the water too.
While we got you here, so I don't know if you know, I have a very popular history podcast, one of the most popular in the world. And one of the things I always enjoy reading about is the origins of the Industrial Revolution. In particular, the question, why did it happen when it did, where it did? Or to put it another way, why didn't the Romans have an Industrial Revolution? I'm sure you're familiar with the very crude steam device that Hero of Alexandria built that was just kind of spun around. There was coal, but nothing happened until about, the 16th, 17th centuries in Britain. And so I want to hear what your take is. Why did it happen, when it did, where it did, and why not somewhere else, and why not sooner?
That's a great question.
So keep me to this because I'm going to go on a few little tangents here. There's a high risk of tangents, right?
Well,
that's what Gary does.
So
but
keep me to it.
Question. And
the first thing I'm going to say is that people are aware of the spinny device described by Hero of Alexandria. What they're less aware of is that throughout a number of other devices that are in the same work, he actually does describe the use of atmospheric pressure to effectively do mechanical work. And I was very surprised by this because in most of the accounts of the history of steam, you don't see this. So the famous one is actually that you've got the use of heating up some air. It's a bit like a steam engine, but it's using exactly the same principles, at least the atmospheric engine that Thomas Newcomen invents in 1712, where you can kind of light a hearth on an altar, or light an altar, and then by heating the air in this enclosed space, it's going to push essentially this mechanism that'll open temple doors. Now that's actually the boring bit. The interesting bit from a history of science point of view is that it resets automatically because it sucks the water back up again into the device, essentially using atmospheric pressure. Now, the way that was understood throughout the whole, actually, interestingly, we don't know that much about the ancient understanding because we've got just a few scraps and fragments. But the way it's understood throughout the whole Middle Ages and well up until about the mid-17th century, and perhaps even a bit beyond then, given the science was still so new and uncertain, is that the universe doesn't allow vacuums, that nature abhors a vacuum, that the universe is a full thing, like it's almost like an enclosed egg, and anything beyond the egg is heaven, right? So even the fixed stars that we see in the night sky, that's the firmament, that's like a literal permanent, that's the outer shell of the egg that we can see blinking at us at night. And so because the universe is full, it just cannot allow there to be an actual absence of matter of any kind. And so because of that, however, although that's wrong, and it's long been thought that the steam engine needed the vacuum science in the mid-17th century to progress, this is actually not the case because there are loads of devices, which there was a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago called Why Wasn't the Steam Engine Invented Earlier? 3-part, again, very, very long piece. But I went into the detail because I started finding more and more effectively early prototype steam engines, which are using atmospheric pressure, right, in exactly the same way that would then be used in the late 17th century by Thomas Savery, by Thomas Newcomen, and that would be exploited by people like James Watt and so on. Which is essentially that all you need to know is that because nature abhors a vacuum, you can start using these kind of what appear to be suction properties, which we now know to be the result of the weight of the atmosphere pushing the water into where a vacuum has been formed. So that's one of the first things I'd say is that, interestingly, the Romans actually did have a pretty advanced understanding of what was required for a steam engine, even more so than I think a lot of people assume. And the spinny thing is actually the least sophisticated of the steam-using devices that Hero describes, right? There's a whole bunch of other ones. Throughout the Middle Ages, there seems to be a pretty common understanding where whoever, I think, is reading the manuscripts, because, the reason we even know what Hero says is that throughout the Middle Ages, people are just copying it out and copying it out and copying it out, by hand, lovingly, working out how these things worked and copying out the book before the invention of printing. So that's part of it. The other thing I'd say, though, in actual answer to the question, is that not only does that deepen the mystery, but in another way, it unfortunately makes the rest of my other answer kind of more boring, which is that we actually forget just how far behind in many other technologies the Romans were, right? They don't have the medieval spinning wheel. They don't have various agricultural implements and technologies. I mean, there's quite a lot of things that they would have to invent to unlock quite a lot of extra surplus. So there are significant innovations. There is quite a significant, just look at the architecture, just look at the kind of, I guess, the feats of geometry that you might say that the Romans are performing. And it's possible that we'll discover more through archaeology or through the decoding of the Herculaneum papyruses and various other things. But from what we currently know about their technology, there's quite a lot of things that are still missing. There's quite a lot of innovation. There's kind of a big innovation gap that they still kind of have quite a lot to do to catch up to the point at which the Industrial Revolution takes off in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And as to my own explanation as to why the Industrial Revolution happened, where and when it did, the thing I'd say is that the thing that when people think of the Industrial Revolution, they think about the kind of Dickensian story of, there's like a bunch of kids down mines or in some factories all going up chimneys. There's lots of coal and soot and iron and steam and cotton. There's certain things that people have in mind, many of which I'd say are actually primarily associated with what happens a bit later on once the Industrial Revolution is already in full swing. And that the actual crucial change takes place around about the 1550s to about 1650, much earlier than most people think when they think about the Industrial Revolution. They can, if you ask people, name a few inventors from that period, I think they'd pretty much draw a blank. Like there's very, very few famous inventors because the textbooks almost always start at about 1700 and actually really from 1760s onwards. I would say that period is actually very much in full swing. And the interesting thing that happens in that 1550 to 1650 century is that England starts to really transform in a way that basically no other economy had ever done before. You see, to set the scene for you, England is basically one of the economic backwaters of Europe, and potentially of the whole world, but certainly of Eurasia, in that it's extremely agrarian. It has basically one export industry where there's a bit of industry involved, which is in wool cloth making. But it's very underpopulated. It hasn't even recovered to the population level that it had by about 1550, that it had well before, just before the Black Death, right? So it's extremely underpopulated, it's extremely empty. There's way more sheep than there are people. It's what we kind of think of as this kind of rural backwater. And certainly a lot of visitors would have thought, yeah, there's, plentiful agricultural produce because it's basically a massive farm.
You've just described New Zealand.
It's effectively a bit like, or it would have seemed, I think, a lot more like New Zealand. I mean, the population is it's not even pushing 5 million at this point. So it goes from that period, from that stage to within that century, becoming one of the places that people are starting to really notice and kind of sitting up and saying, hang on, something's really happening here. You've got the growth of London from being, a pretty unremarkable city, especially for being a capital city of about 50,000 people, to being a metropolis of, over 400,000 people by over the course of that century. You've got rapid urbanization, almost all of it driven by a single city. And at the same time, and this is what's so highly unusual, is that you've actually got even England throughout that whole period is actually usually a grain exporter. So not only is it kind of continuing to grow in terms of its agricultural output, but it's industrializing at the same time. And even people who are living in the countryside are doing more and more industrial pursuits as well. And that effectively never happened. I can't think of a single case in human history before that stage where that had happened before. So England's kind of extremely unusual in that period. And effectively, all of the things that happen later on are kind of building on what's going on there.
That's a pretty good answer. Yeah, I just wanted to hear your take on it because it's one of these questions that I think everyone has. And one of the things I often heard too is that it was a chicken and egg thing with coal. You started digging coal, and then because you started digging coal, you eventually needed the pumps. And the pumps caused the invention of the steam engine, which required coal because you couldn't really use wood on a steam engine. Just didn't have enough energy. It wouldn't be possible. And it was kind of this virtuous cycle that kind of developed of the coal and the steam engine that kind of developed hand in hand.
So in theory, you can use wood in a steam engine, and I
Yeah,
believe
but it's just not as effective.
Yeah. In the United States in the early 19th century, I believe there are quite a few cases of steam engines using wood. So it's certainly possible. I have a post planned that I've been meaning to write for a few years now. I've been kind of slowly collecting evidence, much like with this last one, where there's scattered throughout my notes, so lots of little hints about this is where I'll come back to this for this particular post. But I suspect that which is a narrative that you hear all the time, that this narrative about, because you had coal mines, that it gets and the coal mines get very deep and you need to drain them, therefore the steam engine is invented. I suspect that doesn't quite work. Partly, I think, because you do actually have some pretty deep coal mines already on the continent, particularly around Liège, which is in modern-day Belgium. They're already facing some of these problems with having to go deeper and deeper. But also, the context in which the steam engines are first invented don't seem to have anything to do with coal mines at all. They have a lot to do with copper and tin mines in the southwest of England. And it appears as though the very earliest attempts are in these copper and tin mines, but because they don't have sufficient access to heating material, that it doesn't quite work out. And actually, possibly the very earliest Newcomen engine, and again, the evidence is kind of shaky on this, but it seems as though it wouldn't have had very good access to coal at all, and probably was using peat from a nearby marshland. So it works in retrospect when you look back at how it does end up being very, very successful. But I think there are effectively a few pivots along the way by the promoters of steam engines where they're like, okay, obviously it's not cost effective at the copper or tin mine. Obviously it's not cost effective enough with peat. Let's try it out on one of these flooded coal mines. And then it kind of goes from there, rather than, I think, this story of it being a demand side story where the demand kind of leads to the invention. Basically, almost never in human history, I can't really think of many cases, at least in my own studies, where I found that kind of demand-led story has turned out to be true.
You guys, any more questions about beer?
I don't think so, aside from just being excited about this automated temple doors. And I have a little schematic thing. I'm like, oh, we can have some fun with the brewing system.
I think one of the things that, as Dr. Howes has been talking, one of the things that I'm glad about is that Bobby's not here today.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Because Bobby is our brewer and is Allison's husband.
He's a lovely soul, but dear goodness, he would talk a lot.
Yeah, his mind moves at about 1,000,000 miles an hour, and he would be sitting here. He has a little notebook that he takes notes in. He probably would have, like when you were talking about atmospheric pressure driving mechanization, he probably would have thought maybe we should do that here.
Well, we already have a lot of systems like that where we utilize some of the differences.
Right, but his mind just moves at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and he would have had a number of new things for the brewery.
Yeah.
So maybe can we deny him access to this podcast?
Okay. It's okay. We no, but I think in the end it's funny when I give beer tours of our brewing system, it's really brewing is all about heating things up and cooling things down in a very controlled way. And in the nuances of like the invention of the thermometer, the invention of controlled heating and cooling, those things are revolutionary, at least in terms of making a better pint of beer.
Interestingly, with the invention of the thermometer, that actually also relies on, at least originally relies on, exploiting changes in atmospheric pressure.
Yep.
It's only later that they seal them off and they realize that they can separate the atmospheric, the kind of barometer side from the thermometer side. So the early thermoscopes, which is about, I think the first will have been 1611, a guy called Santorio. It's so good they named him twice, where this Italian comes up with the way of doing it. And around the same time, there's a Dutch guy called Cornelis Drebbel, who's just one of these inventor geniuses. He not only seems to be responsible for what ends up being called the kind of the Donder glass or thunder glass, which is a kind of barometer to show you that there's been a real drop in atmospheric pressure. But he also exploits it to come up with what is effectively a perpetual motion machine, which is actually just exploiting changes in barometric pressure and temperature to make a clock keep going for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and to kind of power this little planetarium. It's called the Eltham Wonder. It was meant to have been, I think, it was for a few decades. It was at one of the royal palaces in England, because he was invited over to try out this new invention. But it's one of those things where he kept it secret as to how it exactly worked. But lots of people, in trying to work out how it was working, seem to have then drawn up some of the earliest illustrations we have of working thermometers, working barometers.
How much of your research has been done in a pub?
The research in the pub. There's a lot of note taking, and well, not note taking, but I'll come up with good lines for whatever I'm writing sometimes mid pint. That's definitely for sure.
Well, that kind of
That's
proves my
true.
theory.
Yeah.
I mean, most of my effective thinking happens here.
Yes.
Yep.
Agreed.
All right, then. I think that's going to conclude this episode. Thanks for being on the show. This was a real treat. Producer of the Respecting the Beer podcast is David Kelso. Without David, this show would not exist. Make sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player so you'll never miss an episode. And feel free to join the Facebook group to get updates between episodes and join the show over on Patreon, where you'll probably hear bits of this episode. Links to both of these are in the show notes. And until next time, please remember to respect the beer.